We all love a good miracle port. There's something undeniably satisfying about watching a game that has absolutely no business running on a handheld console somehow squeeze its way onto Nintendo hardware. We saw it with The Witcher 3, we saw it with Doom Eternal, and we all collectively held our breath watching those games blur into existence at 540p just so we could play them on an airplane. But there's a massive new line in the sand forming. Pearl Abyss's Crimson Desert came out earlier this year, and let's be entirely real for a second. It is an absolute monster of a game. It's got graphics that look like they want to personally melt your graphics card, physics engine interactions that make your CPU sweat, and the kind of scale that makes most modern consoles scream for mercy. So when the developers officially stand up during a shareholder meeting and say, yeah, we're actually getting this thing running on the Switch 2 right now, you have to pause the video, look at your handheld, and wonder what kind of dark magic they are brewing in South Korea. Let's talk about the absolute sheer audacity of even trying this. When Crimson Desert landed in March, the general consensus wasn't just that it looked pretty, it was that the game is a literal technical showcase. Pearl Abyss built this thing on their proprietary black space engine, and they didn't hold back. We're talking about dense swaying grass, realistic mud deformation, dynamic weather that shifts on a dime, and combat particles that look like a fireworks factory exploded inside a medieval blacksmith's shop. Even on a base PlayStation 5, the game has its moments where the frame rate wobbles, and PC users with pretty beefy rigs have had to lean heavily on upscaling just to keep things locked down. So trying to port this to a hybrid handheld, even a next-gen one like the Switch 2, is the equivalent of trying to fit a V8 engine inside a toaster. The fact that Pearl Abyss didn't just laugh off the idea and instead chose to dedicate an entire R&D team to it tells us that they aren't treating the Switch 2 like a neat little toy. They're treating it like a serious piece of hardware. Which brings us to the next point, what the executives are actually admitting out loud. During their recent 2026 shareholder briefing, Pearl Abyss CEO Han Jin Young dropped a bit of a bombshell. He didn't just say they were thinking about a Switch 2 port, he confirmed that they have a build of the game actively up and running on the hardware right now to a point where, and this is a direct quote, basic gameplay is possible. Now, in developer speak, basic gameplay is possible usually means the main character can walk around the map without the console immediately catching fire or crashing back to the dashboard. It's a huge milestone, sure, but the CEO was also incredibly candid. He openly stated that because the Switch 2 still has lower specifications compared to giant home consoles, there are parts they are going to have to give up. We love a candid gaming executive. No corporate fluff, no pretending it's going to run flawlessly at 4K. It's a direct admission that a Switch 2 version is going to require some serious, painful compromises. We actually already have a blueprint for what a scaled down version of this game looks like, and it gives us a massive hint for the Switch 2. If you look at how Crimson Desert runs on the Xbox Series S, the developers had to make some heavy cuts to get it stable. Foliage density got dialed back. Shadow resolution took a massive hit, and some of the more intense ray trace lighting elements were swapped out for more old school traditional lighting solutions. But here's the kicker. The Series S version still looks completely fine when you're actually playing it. Now take that exact optimization mindset, shrink it down a bit further, and factor in the Switch 2's unique superpower, NVIDIA hardware. Unlike the AMD chips inside the Xbox and PlayStation, the Switch 2 is packing NVIDIA architecture, which means it has access to DLSS. If Pearl Abyss can use deep learning super sampling to render the game at a low internal resolution, say 720p or even lower, and let NVIDIA's AI smarts upscale it to look crisp on a handheld screen, the dream of a portable Crimson Desert becomes way less impossible. Why are they putting themselves through this technical nightmare in the first place? Well, because money talks, and Crimson Desert is currently shouting the game has been an absolute juggernaut since launch. It pulled in a ridiculous 2 million sales on day one and hit over 6 million copies sold in less than 3 months for a brand new single-player IP coming out of a South Korean studio known mostly for MMOs. Those are historical industry-shaking numbers. When you have a hit that massive, your next immediate thought as a publisher is, How do we get this in front of the largest, most dedicated audience on Earth? And historically, that answer is Nintendo. Leaving the Switch 2 player base out of the equation means leaving millions of potential sales on the table. Pearl Abyss is looking at the massive install base Nintendo is about to build, and they realize that spending a year or two in optimization hell is entirely worth the massive payday waiting for them on the other side. But let's talk about the real boogeyman here for next point. The CPU bottleneck. When people talk about porting heavy games to weaker consoles, everyone immediately complains about the graphics. Oh, the textures are gonna look like blurry mud. The resolution is gonna drop. Honestly, lowering graphics settings is the easy part. You can always compress a texture or turn off a fancy reflection. The real nightmare for a Switch 2 port is the processor load. Crimson Desert isn't just a pretty face, it's an incredibly systemic game. When you enter a major city or a massive siege battle, the game is calculating the artificial intelligence, physics, and pathfinding for dozens of NPCs simultaneously. Trees are breaking, structures are taking damage, and chunks of rock are flying across the screen. The Switch 2's portable processor is going to be hit incredibly hard by those systems. To make this port work, Pearl Abyss might not just have to turn down the graphics sliders, they might actively have to change how the game functions, like reducing the number of soldiers in a battle or shortening how far away NPCs can spawn. We need to throw out the old rules of what an impossible port even means. For the last several years, whenever a major third-party game got ported to Nintendo hardware, the developer's main goal was basically just make it boot up and don't let it crash. We forgave text that was too small to read, texturing that looked like smeared Vaseline, and frame rates that dipped into the low 20s because, hey, you're playing Skyrim on the toilet, who cares? But with the Switch 2, the baseline has shifted dramatically. Audiences aren't going to accept a version of Crimson Desert that runs at 15 frames per second and looks like a PS2 game. The legacy of the Miracle port, where we praise developers just for getting a game to run, is over. Pearl Abyss knows this. By publicly announcing that they're investigating this port, they are setting a standard that it needs to be an actually good way to play the game, not just a tech novelty you show your friends for 5 minutes before switching back to your PC. Nintendo needs this just as much as Pearl Abyss does. Look, first-party games are always going to carry Nintendo hardware. A new Zelda or Mario will sell millions of consoles without breaking a sweat. But if the Switch 2 wants to avoid the dreaded secondary console curse, where people only buy it for Nintendo games and play everything else on an Xbox or PlayStation, it desperately needs heavy hitting, contemporary third-party titles right out of the gate. If Crimson Desert lands on the platform and runs smoothly, it sends a massive signal to every other major publisher in the industry. It proves that the new hardware can handle modern, cutting-edge game engines without requiring a complete ground-up remake. It turns the Switch 2 into a viable launch target for multi-platform blockbusters instead of an afterthought that gets a downgraded port 3 years late. Pearl Abyss has a massive secret weapon here, and it's their engine. A huge chunk of modern games are built on Unreal Engine 5 right now, and while Unreal is incredibly powerful, it's also notoriously heavy and sometimes difficult for external developers to deeply optimize for specific mobile chips. But as we mentioned earlier, Crimson Desert runs on Pearl Abyss's custom in-house Blackspace engine. Because they own the keys to the entire kingdom, they don't have to wait for a massive tech corporation to release a software update or patch a performance bug. If their engine is struggling with memory bandwidth on Nintendo's new chip, their engineers can literally rewrite the engine's core code specifically to exploit the quirks of that hardware. That kind of flexibility is exactly how studios pull off absolute technical wizardry. At the end of the day, the fact that Pearl Abyss is openly discussing this build with their investors means this isn't just some pipe dream or a hypothetical concept. They are actively putting in the work to see if it's possible, and given their track record of pushing hardware boundaries, we definitely shouldn't count them out. It's going to take some time, it's going to require some serious graphical sacrifices, but the payoff could be absolutely massive. But hey, we want to know what you think. Do you think a game as massive and visually insane as Crimson Desert can actually run well on the Switch 2? Or are we setting ourselves up for a beautifully optimized slideshow? Are you planning on picking this up on a handheld? Or are you strictly sticking to PC and home consoles for this one?